that. All right, it appears as though we are streaming, folks, and so I'm going to post this feed, and then we're going to get to work here. The challenge of this, of course, is that I'm the guy posting all of the feeds and doing all of this, but in this particular case, I'm also the presenter, so I'm pulling double duty, and I hope everybody bears with us for a second while we get this running. So, Kate, if you don't mind, just to confirm you're seeing the right stuff, you are seeing just the PowerPoint slide with the games in the classroom intro slide, and that's the only thing you're seeing up there right now, correct? Alrighty. Just making sure I don't have too much extra stuff on the screen or anything. And to the audience, just a warning, I have the Canes Hurricanes playoff game going on in the background. So if you hear an exclamation of joy, it's because the Canes scored. And if you hear some muttered curse words, it's because the Rangers scored. So hope everybody can live with that. All right, we're going to get started here. What we've got today is this is built around and based on a professional development presentation that I've done a couple of different times for both university level instructors and secondary education, so high school, and even I even did this one time for a group of middle school teachers. And the idea here is to talk about how games and sims can be put into use in the classroom, and starting with some underlying theoretical ideas and then building forward, rolling it forward from there. And so we're going to talk about a couple of different examples for folks here. We're going to be heavily social science influenced because that's primarily where my background is. Combination of the wargaming world, my graduate work in both journalism and communication, a lot of graduate work at the PhD level towards uses of interactivity in training and learning. So that's generally where we're working towards in all of this. And I say that by way of making sure folks sort of understand the perspective with which we're approaching this presentation. So with all that in mind, let me get my screen moving here. Come on, screen. There we are. So who am I? What are we doing? How are we going to do it? That's what we're looking at for today. So I'm Brant Guillory. I'm a game designer. I was a war game designer for both Harness Electrons and Oberon Associates. Did a variety of professional level work for the National Security Agency, for the National Defense University. A couple of other consulting gigs with the Marines and the Maritime Civil Affairs folks. I've also been a game designer in the commercial space with Bayonet Games, a couple of different published war games and role-playing games. And then I was also doing some work while I was in grad school at Ohio State for the Ohio Department of Health with some different exercises there, some tabletop exercises mostly, towards pandemic preparedness. This was about 15 years ago when everybody was terrified of the bird flu. I've been a seminar leader at both the Connections Game Conference and the Origins War College, and then game writer and reviewer going back over 25 years with RPG.net, Scry Magazine, Wargamer.com, Armchair General Magazine, all kinds of different folks that I've written for over the years. And then I've also, I'm the guy that runs the Armchair Dragoons. I got plenty of people that actually do the work at Armchair Dragoons, but I'm the guy whose name's kind of on the masthead there. And at the university level, I've been an instructor at Ohio State University, at William Peace University, Wake Tech, the University of South Carolina, a couple other places. I just ran out of space on the slide. So what are we doing? We're talking about games in the classroom. We're going to look at some theoretical breakdowns of what those game things look like, talk about some practical examples of putting games to use, and then also what are some ideas we've got moving forward in the game world there. So hang on half a second. All righty. So I want to get some definitions out of the way up front. And what I'm focusing on here with these definitions are not the be-all and end-all. This is the only way in which to define these things. I want to clarify the ways in which I intend to use these terms in this presentation. And we can have all sorts of tautological discussions and talk ourselves in circles later as to what these things could mean or should mean or mean to other people. Don't care about any of that. This is what we're referring to in this presentation. So when we talk about learning something, we are talking about new skill acquisition. I didn't already know this before. Now I know it. When we're talking about training, we're talking about something I already know and I am rehearsing that skill. So it's the difference, think of the difference between learning new vocabulary in a foreign language and then practicing that vocabulary in context in constructing sentences and having conversations. Similarly, when we talk games, I am speaking of a competitive exercise that has winners and losers as a part of it. A game, you got to be keeping score. And so just going for a jog, you're not keeping score. Running a foot race, now we're keeping score. Whereas a simulation is an attempt to reflect some kind of real-world phenomenon that is somehow replicated or modeled in that tool. You'll notice those are not necessarily mutually exclusive definitions, and that is intentional. So for today, learning, acquisition of a new skill, exposure to new concepts or vocabulary, exposure to new processes. Training, we're looking on things we already know how to do. This is not the first time you're using the skill. We are practicing it. We are practicing known skills. We are practicing existing knowledge. This is stuff I already know. All right, very important thing. Games don't involve power chords, or they don't have to. It's amazing in the academic environment, especially in the communication world that I came out of. As soon as the word game comes out of your mouth, everybody envisions a power chord. And there was a great example of this at an academic conference one time. I'm sitting in the back of a panel discussion talking about games and game effects and things going on with game players, and everything they're describing was digital. And when we got to the 5-minute Q&A at the end, I kind of raised my hand, I flagged down the microphone, and I asked a question. I said, everything you guys are talking about is digital. Did you guys consider examining manual games at all, tabletop games, like non-digital games? And the guy looked completely perplexed, one of the speakers up on the podium. And he's like, can you give me an example? And I said, well, chess, right? I mean, everybody's got a chessboard in their house somewhere. Most people do. At some point or another, you saw a chess game on a table. I was just like, what about chess? And the guy kind of shrugged, and he's like, well, you can play chess on a computer. And he went on to the next question. And I got up and walked out because that kept me from throwing a chair at him mostly. But when we're talking about games in this context, we are not necessarily talking about plugging power cords into walls. There's a lot you can do with game learning effects that do not involve digital games. So they are inherently competitive. There needs to be some kind of scorekeeping mechanism, and we have rules and requirements that are repeated with each iteration of the game. We're following the same rules in the game, so this isn't Calvin ball. Right, we're sticking with the same rules as we go. So if you're playing tic-tac-toe, you get to put one mark each turn. Somebody doesn't get to put 2 marks this turn. You use the same mark over and over. You only got 9 spaces in which you can put it. So we've got rules and requirements that stay the same every time we do this. The other thing that's very important in all of this is that there is a requirement of some participant choice in this idea of a game. And this is one of the things that ends up ruling out some kids' games. And this is important to think about. If you think about the game Candyland, what's the actual choice for the player in Candyland? Right? You flip a card, you go to where the card tells you to go. The next person flips their card and they go somewhere. And this isn't to say that Candyland isn't a fun exercise for a kid sitting, a 3-year-old sitting around with mom and dad, learning to take turns, learning to interpret, the visuals on the card with where to go somewhere, to have some fun doing something with the parents. That's all totally cool, but it's not a game because there's no real choice involved in all of this. You either move or you don't. Same thing with snakes and ladders, right? You roll the dice, you move to where the dice told you to roll. It's not like you roll the dice and pick one of the two. There's no choice involved. So that's something that's important to be mindful of when we're talking about games. You got to have some kind of participant choice involved in there. Simulation, again, for today's discussion, we are attempting to model some facet of reality. We're trying to replicate some known phenomenon. Now, there are things that we have to inherently abstract out. We all understand that, but there's no requirement for scorekeeping. And you think about a flight simulator, military flight simulators, nobody's keeping score, right? It's practicing flying a plane around. Civilian flight simulators that learn to fly jet airliners, same thing. There's no trying to keep score. Now, the Microsoft Flight Simulator that you can play on your home computer, they grafted a scorekeeping mechanism onto that. They slapped a point total on there based on how well you keep your plane in the air. And that's fine, but that's fairly artificial. You can still do everything in there without keeping score, and who the hell cares? In some cases, a simulation may not even require a participant. Right, you can set up a simulation of a certain phenomenon, bacterial reproduction under certain conditions in a lab, and have the computer just simulate it all, hit go, get out of the way, come back and see what the results are. And that's fine. Like there is a place in the world for that, but understand that the point at which you're running a simulation that doesn't even require a participant, we are squarely outside of game land, because game land requires participants who can make choices. And that's where we start to get a little exclusive of those two things. So, to reiterate, we're looking at new skill acquisition versus existing skill rehearsal. And we're looking at inherently competitive exercises. And we're also simulations. We're attempting to model something in the real world somehow. All right, mandatory quote number one, because you got to have quotes from other people, because that's how you get your external validity, right? So Greg Kostikian is great at pointing out that according to Will Wright, SimCity is not a game, it's a toy, right? Here's a ball. You can bounce it, twirl it, play a game with it if you want, but it's the external requirements that you put on the ball that turn the ball into a piece of the game. SimCity is a simulator tool for the city building itself, but it's the external goals that you slap on SimCity that turn it into a game. Can you build the lowest pollution city? Can you build one with the least amount of traffic problems? Can you build one that's Godzilla proof? Like whatever those extra player defined objectives are is what you throw into there. And so that's an example of a difference between where game and sim sort of exist in orthogonal directions. Here are an example of some different theoretical approaches to how to define and describe games. This is not to say that one is better than the other or that these are the only three out there. These are just three examples that we're pulling out just to show that there are varying schools of thought on different theoretical approaches to games. Kostikian, obviously, one of the shorter ones there. That's from his column, I Have No Words and I Must Design. But Asghari's got another one, with the describing the structural components in greater detail. Prensky is another fairly well-known one. Games have rules, games have goals, games are interactive, they have outcomes and feedback, they are adaptive. So these are a couple of examples of theoretical approaches, but again, not intended to be all-encompassing. All right, quickly. Anybody got any questions? You can throw them in the chat. You can come off a mute and throw them at me. Whatever floats your boat. I'm fine with any of the above. All right. We'll keep moving. And Aaron, don't worry about being late, because it took us a second to get the streaming cranked up anyway. So you're totally fine. Yeah, so how do games and simulations interact and overlap as a part of all this? So this is a grid that I put together for a column for Battles magazine years ago based on some other more theoretical work that I'd done back when I was at Ohio State. And simulations and games exist on a pair of axes that are not necessarily in mutual opposition to each other. Simulations are a measure of varying levels of abstraction, whereas games are varying levels of competitiveness. So you can have something that is very realistic and very competitive, and now you're in the simulation realm that includes gameplay. Or similarly, it can be very abstract, and you still have a game, but it's not necessarily a simulation of something. So as we look at this, training and learning, hang on, make sure, okay. So training and learning new concepts may happen in a very abstracted setting. We are learning vocabulary divorced from its meaning within a paragraph or a sentence or any sort of conversational context. We're just trying to learn what the words mean. as opposed to training that incorporates those skills in context. Am I using the jargon and terminology in the correct context? Am I using mutually supporting or overlapping skills? I have to use this skill first in order to use this skill second. And so am I in a position where I'm confronted with multiple ways in which to solve a problem and I am expected to pick the right one? So now it's not just have I mastered multiple skills, but have I mastered the ability to assess which skill to use in a particular context? And you think about the medical profession and folks that need to know which test to run in which order with which kind of patient presenting which kinds of symptoms. Like I can learn all of these tests individually, but now I've got to understand how to put them all together in a particular sequence, and that may matter. So, as we're looking at games versus sims, we can use games in a very abstract setting, in a very competitive setting towards learning, where we're doing simple competitive vocabulary exercises, right? Because the ability to abstract those things makes it very easy to slap a scorekeeping mechanism on there. Did you get the answer right or not? Whereas training, by putting those things in context, we now have a much busier ecosystem in which we're expected to operate. And it may be a less competitive setting, but it is a more realistic setting in which we are rehearsing our existing skills. So, National Defense University outright ripped off my idea. Mike Gallopi even admits it. He's used this in a variety of his presentations, but he's totally said, yeah, I completely ripped off your idea. And so, for the kinds of things they do, they have some simulations or strategic games or tabletop exercises or operational tactical specific kinds of games. And so, like a tabletop exercise, let's get all of the people around the table that need to be involved in the actual inaugural parade through Washington, D.C., and let's talk through the map on the tabletop exercise of who goes where, when, at what time to do which actions, right? There's nothing competitive about that. It's also very abstract because it's a bunch of people around a map on a tabletop moving pushpins around. That's an example of a non-competitive abstract thing that applies far more to them than it necessarily does in a classroom for us. And Aaron, yes, the castle folks, again, Colonel Gallopi's been retired for 10 years now. So this was a while ago, or almost 10 years now. But yes, that's the guys over at NDU that did that. So at the professional level, when we're looking at professional level training, so this is not in a classroom environment. This is the military. This is EMS. This is guys that need this kind of training for real. We have similar continuums of realism versus competitiveness, but different application of the labels based on the uses. And that's what the NDU was doing with their version of this, is that they put slightly different labels on the kinds of things that we were just describing in the previous matrix. So the idea of like a tabletop exercise, again, you're almost never going to see that in a school context, but it's a very important thing in a professional context. So we're back to our training versus learning matrix here. And we're also going to take a look at some theoretical background here. So Greitzer, Kuchar, and Houston proposed this two-axis model of identifying the optimal zone for learning and motivation. And that is you need to match the game difficulty that you're presenting your players with to their ability or level of learning, or they're not going to get anything out of it. And so that optimal zone, as their ability goes up, the challenge, the skill, the difficulty in the game should get harder. Similarly, the guy whose name I can never pronounce, Sistamahali, I'm not even going to try. Like, I butcher this dude's name every time. He has this idea of flow that you will find in a lot of academic literature, and that's the idea that the challenge needs to match the skill, and that keeps somebody in the flow channel, that if your skill exceeds the challenge by too much, you're just going to get bored, whereas if the challenge exceeds your skill by too much, you're going to experience a feeling of anxiety, and you're going to get anxious about stuff, and now you're not paying attention to what should be happening in that flow channel. There's an example in the background here as I'm presenting with the flow channel. My son is actually going through a big raid on Destiny 2 with a couple of friends of his. And they're some pretty high-ranking players, so they've got some pretty high-skill challenges that they have to play their way through to maintain that level of flow in the flow channel. All right, so we're back to our learning versus training axis, and you can see that all of these things are sort of moving in the same direction, aren't they? And once we sort of start laying everything on top of it, the difficulty of the game tends to go up as we make the game more realistic, because now there are more balls you have to juggle and more varying facets of the game you have to pay attention to. Similarly, player skill tends to go up. As player skill tends to go up, we may move from purely competitive things to less competitive things, or variable levels of competition within the game axis. But that is what helps us maintain that optimal state of flow and that zone of learning and motivation in there. So what does this all mean? Greater levels of ability allow for greater levels of complexity in the games we use, right? But those greater levels of complexity do not necessarily require a game. We don't have to keep score. But participants will require an increase in their difficulty in order to stave off boredom, in order to minimize anxiety. We've got to maintain the challenge in front of them appropriate to the level of skill that they're at. So that's what we're looking at when we start talking training versus learning here. All right. With all of that, I'm going to take a breath. If anybody's got questions, throw questions at me. I'm going to take a sip of my drink here while we do this, and then we'll move on. Yeah. So funny you should ask. We're actually about to. Yeah, we're actually going to get into a couple of those here on some subsequent slides. So no, it's a great question. It's absolutely a valid question. We're going to get into a couple of them on some subsequent slides here shortly. If I don't fully answer the question there, come back around and let's ask it again and have a little more conversation. So, um, so so our most common uses that we're looking at are those learning and training pieces that we talked about earlier on. And so an example of a difference between learning and training is we've got the learning with the quiz show that's set up right there in the class, right? We're learning different parts of physiology. We're learning different terms within a medical environment, whereas training, we're actually putting hands on the mannequin and trying to revive the mannequin on the gurney, where it's not simply can I recite what A, B, and C stand for, but do I know, do I check airway, breathing, and circulation in the appropriate sequence in the appropriate place on the mannequin? Am I checking the pulse in the arm when there's, like a bleeding wound in the upper arm? Like there's no point checking the pulse in the wrist at that point. So that's a difference between some of the learning versus training that you might run into there. Um, so as we're looking at learning versus training, that's an example of that new skill acquisition versus existing skill rehearsal. Another common use for games in those learning and training environments are the ability to explore some decision making from the participants through particular ways, such as role playing or recreating some historical events in context. And examples there, the Model UN. Again, not necessarily, this isn't an inherently competitive exercise in the Model UN, but it does attempt to replicate a particular facet of reality. And so at that point, we're way up on the simulation side in that upper right quadrant, where we're not necessarily being competitive, but we're having to engage various diplomatic tools that we may have learned about in advance of the Model UN. How do we debate? How do we negotiate? How do we try and prioritize our interests while still being able to support others' similar interests, even when they don't perfectly align with ours? Can we operate within a more complex context like that, where I've got to juggle multiple competing interests that all want my attention? And that's an example of making decisions through role playing, putting yourself in someone else's shoes there. An example in historical context, again, we look, this is pure war game over there on the right. That's the coin game Fire in the Lake. So this is Vietnam War. And so this gives you an opportunity to explore within historical context some of the decision making that the different participants in the Vietnam War have made over time. And and some of those decisions, you look back at them today and you think, man, that was a dumb idea. But then you put yourself in the shoes of the person at the time and you're thinking, oh, well, hey, now I understand why they may have done this. There's a great story in an article on War on the Rocks from Jim Lacey, and I want to say he was teaching at the Army War College at the time, but I don't remember for sure where it was that he was teaching at the time. But they were studying Peloponnesian Wars. In the middle of the Peloponnesian Wars, like, there's a whole fleet that takes off and attacks Sicily. And you're thinking, what the hell? Like, Sicily's halfway across the Med. Like, why are you going after Sicily? And everybody reading a history of the Peloponnesian Wars universally agrees this is dumb. But then you sit down to actually play the game, and suddenly, in order to maintain your forces in the field, guys got to eat, right? You've got to be able to feed people. And what is there over on Sicily but a whole lot of wheat fields? There is a gigantic food supply sitting over in Sicily waiting for somebody to take control. Well, darn if, like, why don't I go take control of the wheat fields in Sicily? Now I can feed my forces to keep them in the field. Suddenly that decision to sail 400 miles in the wrong direction makes a little more sense. And so that's an example of decision making in within its historical context. Another use that's sometimes discussed is the idea of supporting decision making. Sebastian touched on this a little bit earlier with his analytical war games, right? We need to analyze a particular something to help us support some future decisions that we need to make. So, are we testing a course of action? Are we testing a particular process? This allows us to compare different things by simply tweaking some minor conditions and seeing what happens. And so, this is also referred to as hypothesis testing. What are some different things that can come out of our hypotheses? So the great example within the military, of course, is that they use this to explore different courses of action during planning for a particular mission. One of the steps in the military decision-making process is wargaming out varying courses of action, and it's not simply did I win or lose. You also have to account for other considerations in the course of action. Which one is most sustainable? Which one allows me to maintain particular control of terrain features if that's part of my mission? And so it's not simply did I kill more of the bad guys than not. There may be other considerations as a part of all of this. And so that's an idea of supporting some decision making. Let's play through a couple of different choices that we have and see what the outcomes are, and then pick one from the available outcomes that way. Something that's almost never discussed, and this was one of the things that we did at the National Defense University with the Gemstone game up there. Longtime listeners of our podcast will be more than sick of hearing me talk about Gemstone, but it was a really cool project that we worked on while we were there. And this is the idea of an introduction to new material. Sit down in class, and the first thing you do is here, you're playing a game about the topic in class. And it does a couple of things. It's building interest in the material because you're diving right in. Like, you are in the soup having to figure out how to work your way through whatever this material in your class is. But it also gives the instructors the ability to gauge whatever existing knowledge or expertise people are coming into the class with. Let me see how well they do this so I know what level I can tailor my class to approach. Are they outright novices with no knowledge at all, or is there some existing skill level that I can build on? The other thing that it does is now everybody in the classroom has a shared common frame of reference from at least one event that's topical to our discussion that everybody can always refer back to and say, hey, you remember when the first week of class this particular thing happened? And everybody knows what it is that happened. Again, undergrad English major here. way too long ago than we need to talk. 20 mumble years ago. Um, it was always assumed that students coming into college had read a handful of Shakespearean plays in high school, and that as an English instructor, there was an expected frame of reference that you could always go back and point to Shakespeare and go, hey, you remember this scene in Romeo and Juliet, or do you remember this scene in Macbeth? And everybody in the room would kind of nod and go, yeah, sure, I remember that. Okay, let's build forward. Somewhere not too long after I was out of college, talking to some friends of mine that were in school or were instructors in college, that Shakespeare no longer became the common frame of reference. You could no longer assume that folks coming out of high school had read a certain amount of Shakespearean plays before they managed to escape high school and head off into college. Um, so this gives you the ability to create that common frame of reference for the participants in your course. That was something that the Gemstone game did. The International Counterterrorism Fellows program, the first week of the class, they were playing the Gemstone game that we had worked with NDU to design. And so it accomplished all of these things. It gave all of those participants some instant interest in the material because, oh my God, I got to deal with this right now. But the faculty got a chance to see what the participants in the class knew coming into the class. Like, do these people actually understand the concepts of dealing with a counterinsurgency at the strategic level, or do we have blank slates that we've got to start filling in? But they, throughout the year, they would go back to those gemstone exercises and say, hey, remember when this happened in the exercise and we dealt with it this way? Well, what if we had done this other thing instead? So, um, so aftershock is certainly one of those things that you could do. This is one that the Pack Sims guys have made available, and so this is an opportunity for again a shared learning experience around humanitarian disaster relief that was actually designed coming out of one of the Connections conferences. 2012, I believe it was. There were a handful of us that Rex had set up as leading different teams through some initial design ideas, and then Rex kind of took a lot of the best of the ideas from the design stuff, and he and Gary Melanti sort of workshopped a handful of those things at the hotel bar one evening, and then Rex took a lot of that stuff home and worked with a bunch of other people to build out what is now the Aftershock game that's been around for 6-7 years now, and been very popular in a variety of different professional environments. Talked a bunch about the gemstone stuff. We'll move on from there. Um, hey, we forgot one. What about introductions to each other? What if we just use these games as kind of a team building exercise? Let the classmates get to know each other. This is especially useful for classes in which there may be a sequence of classes where people are going to stay together for a while. So something like nursing school or engineering school, where you've got the same cohort of 20 odd people that you're going to be in school with most of those folks for the next 2 years or so. Um, so uh, whoops. So an example there, one thing to keep in mind with that is it's very hard to do with very large classes or very small classes. Very large classes, there's just too many people. You're not going to actually get introduced to everybody else. Very small classes, it tends to go pretty quick. There's probably better ways in which you can sort of get to know each other than just blowing through one of these. All right. So, Aaron, did that get to answering some of the questions for you? Because if not, I got some more stuff coming up here that might start answering some of those questions. So, um, yeah. So the CISA folks were the faculty observers. They weren't the folks we were specifically working with. We were working specifically with the Castle folks. Yeah, well, so that was the course that we were supporting, but the people that we actually dealt with were the actual Castle folks themselves, the Center for Applied Strategic Learning. They were the ones they were the ones actually running the exercise. We helped build the software to support the exercise, but they were the ones that were actually in the room talking to the participants, guiding the participants up on stage and all that. We helped build the software, and we were in the room. I mean, I say we. I was the representative of our company that was in the room while all these things were going on, but I didn't really have a role in terms of leading the exercise at all. That was Colonel Galopi and Ellie Bartels and Tim Wilkie and all kinds of other folks. Yeah. Yeah, that was after we were done with the gemstone stuff, But yeah, the CISA guys were part of who we were supporting. Um, Kate had a question here. Can I distinguish it as learning as recitation and training as consequence? That's not a bad way to look at it. Um, Particularly because learning, as you're characterizing it there, it is fairly divorced from consequences, other than maybe a bad grade on a vocabulary quiz. Um, but the intent is to when you're first learning stuff, you abstract things out quite a bit. An example of that is how do I put together, assemble a Singar's radio for usage. So I've got to make sure I put the battery in the right way, that I'm connecting the microphone the right way, that I get the power supply hooked up, that I've got the antenna plugged in correctly for the range that I'm expected to talk. And so that's one thing. But then when I've got to actually install a Singars in a vehicle, put the fill in, now join a particular radio net and authenticate correctly, and then start sending message traffic, now I'm layering multiple skills on top of each other. And having to do them all in the right sequence, not just do each one of them discreetly. So all of that starts to become important. I've got to put the fill in before after I connect to the vehicle power, because when I plug in the vehicle power, it causes a spike in the Singar's radio that drops the fill. So sequencing becomes important at that point. All right. So what are we trying to learn versus what are we trying to train? And so when we're trying to decide what it is we want to play, part of what we need to look at, learning, we're focused on what are the right answers. Give me the right answers. Do the players know the right answer, and what kind of feedback am I providing to the player based on whether or not they give me the right answer? Am I simply telling them, no, you're wrong, or am I guiding them towards a more correct answer? Am I saying, well, that's kind of right, but not completely? Like, how's the best way to make sure that they can provide that right answer? So that recitation, Kate, as you described it there. When I'm looking more in the training world, I'm more concerned with what is the right process, and do the players know that process, and can they put it together correctly within the process? And another example there is, again, I'm using a lot of military examples because I spent 14 years in uniform after growing up in the military for 20-something years, and then spent 10 years as a defense contractor. So you're going to get a heap and help in the defense stuff out of this, because that's what I know best. But an example of that is, out at Fort Irwin at the National Defense University, like, did you zero your weapon correctly is something that we worry about with the privates and sergeants, making sure that those individual level skills are handled correctly. But we can train those back at home station. What the National Defense University is what the National Training Center is mostly concerned with is, within the context of those battalion and brigade staffs, did you correctly execute your process such that you set your subordinate units up for the best chance of success during the battle? Um, and so did you do the right process in the right order, to get to the right kinds of outcomes that you needed to support your soldiers out in the field that are actually trying to execute the missions with which you provide them? And so they are very process focused there, and not as much task focused, because that task level stuff you should be handling back at your home station before you ever get to Fort Irwin. All right, so when we're decision focused, what are the decisions we want those participants to make, and how do we reward that correct decision making? Do we let them continue on in the game? Are we giving them points as whatever the score is? Like, what's the feedback mechanism that you're providing to your participants to say, hey, I'm doing good, or I'm not doing good? And so what's the type, timing, and content of those feedback messages to your participants? Whereas when I'm process focused, what are the decisions we want the participants to make within the process? And part of that decision making may be, which process do I choose? And that's something that can be challenging to account for as the external advisor and observer that has to evaluate the performance of somebody in one of these process-focused games. So how do we reward the correct execution of the process, or the correct selection of the right process? And so how do we keep our participants from focusing on winning, from just trying to score points, and instead focus on getting the process right? And that's one of the reasons why we move from competitive to less competitive environments as we get into something that's more complex. We want people choosing the right steps in the process more than we want them just trying to rack up points. So set of categorizations here. The Ohio Department of Health was looking at simple versus complex. Is there a clear outcome versus a vague outcome? And so outcome-oriented tasks versus process-focused tasks. When you may have a more vague outcome, you are focused more on the process. One of the things we set up in all of this was the tabletop exercise of how do you set up vaccination clinics for a bird flu pandemic. Bird flu was all the rage back in 2005, 6, and 7, so that's what everybody cared about. And so there's not necessarily a right answer for how you configure a school gymnasium for here's your intake, here's your actual vaccination station, here's your observation station, here's where you check people out, here's where you're keeping track of who was vaccinated so we're not double vaccinating people, or we can go back and find the gap. Like there's a whole bunch of things that need to happen. But whether you have people come in the left door or the right door, like there's no right or wrong answer. Just justify the decision you made. Are you making the right decisions in the right process for how to set these things up? And are you getting everything set up before you communicate out to the public, hey, we're set up, come on in? Well, depending on how quickly you get set up, you may be sitting there for 2 days before word gets out and people start showing up. So is that maximizing the use of your resources? So those sorts of process-focused tasks, that process-focused decision-making leads to more complex outcomes. So that's part of what you're looking at there. Another view of how to pick games, the Army Command and General Staff College looks at decision versus process focused, and they look at short versus long term is one of the categorizations they use. And this is the guys at, it used to be the Digital Leader Development Center. They're now the Games and Simulations Training Directorate, or they change names too frequently for me to keep up with them all. This is James Sterrett's guys down in the basement of the Lewis and Clark building. And so they look at short term versus long term. Is this 18 to 72 hours or 96 or so hours, those short-term events right there, that is fighting a battle, right? That is kinetic combat right now. Versus long-term stuff, we're looking at things with 6-month, 1 year, 18-month, 2-year sorts of time horizons. And so if we're looking at things that are decision-focused, we're focused on the commander. Is the commander making the right decisions within those contexts to come to the outcome that you're after, whereas the process-focused things are more staff-focused. Is the staff doing the right things in the right process, in the right way, in the right sequence to get to the kinds of outcomes that they should be producing as a collective unit? And so that's where you're looking at the difference between decision versus process focus. The staff doesn't make decisions. The staff executes a process to provide information to the commander to make the decisions. So the staff-focused games, like the major combat operations using Janus or decisive action, those staff-focused things are all focused on, is the staff able to execute the appropriate process to provide information for the commander to make that decision? I got to have the staff there to do that. For a commander to simply practice decision making, I don't have to have the whole staff there to do that. Hey, commander, here's a bunch of information your staff may have given you. Like, I can simulate that, make a choice, and the commander can make a choice and keep on going. Hang on, isn't all this supposed to be fun? All right, so mandatory quote number 2, right? How do you make a game fun? Design a game and take out everything that isn't fun. All right, so let's define fun. and that gets tricky, right? But the real question is fun actually what we're after? And while there's a certain school of thought that says that folks that are having more fun are retaining the information a little better because they're paying more attention, there may be times where you just can't make things fun. And that's okay, because part of what games in the classroom are doing is they're a break from that normal rhythm of class. And so is fun necessarily the purpose of the game, or is it simply something that we hope for in order to maintain engagement with our participants? And so if fun isn't that primary goal, how far away from fun are we willing to go in using the game in the classroom just to break up the monotony of, lectures in PowerPoint or recitation of things out of a book or whatever? So we're trying to gain and maintain attention. Are we enjoying this? What are those stakes? Is this outside the norm? If you have an entire class that is built around nothing but game after game after game after game, then you're not outside the norm. There isn't novelty to this. And so that's something to be mindful of as you're plowing through this. Now, there are secondary learning effects, and this is one of those informal learning things. These two folks over at the UK Learning Skills Development Agency have noted significant informal learning effects from game players, historical learning from role playing folks or strategy and conflict game folks. Um, it's funny that one of the guys that I know through wargaming channels could probably sit down and go toe to toe with just about any historian out there on the Battle of Kursk. For whatever reason, this dude has decided that he loves the Battle of Kursk and he's going to learn every possible facet that he can about Kursk, play every game about Kursk, whatever he can find about it. The guy's a house painter. Like his professional, the way he pays his bills, he paints houses and he does a variety of other electrical work as well on the side. But you know, could Jay sit down and have an intelligent conversation with David Glantz about Kursk? Probably. But he's learned it all through wargaming. And that's historical learning that he has picked up from the different games that he's played and the designer notes and the background information that he's read about the games that he's played. How good do you get at your math skills just calculating things on the fly from odds-based games? Right? You ever met blackjack players that can just calculate stuff on the fly in their head as they go? I mean, they can just whip out probabilities instantly. So those are some examples of secondary learning effects. And so this ties back into what Sebastian was talking about earlier. Do we have to play them? What about game design as an assignment? Being able to demonstrate a mastery of the material and the ability to synthesize concepts by, here, go design this game, right? So now I've got to figure out what's important to my game. What are the things I want my players to take away from the game and isolate those and abstract out everything else that might get in the way. And this is a different way to engage the students with the material. If you saw Sawyer's presentation this morning about the Heroes Rising Three Kingdoms game that her team designed for Sebastian's class, they went and dug into a ton of historical material about that Three Kingdoms era of China and found all kinds of books. There was a graphic novel, there were TV shows, there was all kinds of other historical material that they could go dig up to learn about this specific era in China. So yeah, they're in a war game class. They're learning how to design war games, but along the way they're learning a ton about China right around, I think it was around the 200 or so CE at the time. So this gives you an opportunity to really engage with the material from a different perspective. Obviously, a lot of considerations in this. Is this teams? Is this solo? How much material are you going to provide? Are you only doing stuff in class, or is this something that they're expected to work on outside of class? At the university level, you're rolling your eyes and you're going, yeah, they're going to work on this outside of class. But at the middle school level, that may not be relevant or appropriate. Like, how do you get a bunch of 13-year-olds together outside of class to work on these things? So that's something that you have to consider. You also need to figure out what your grading rubric looks like as a part of all this. What are the things that you expect the students to provide, and how are you going to score their outcome from that game? So let's talk about a couple of different success stories. Well, before I do, mandatory question break. Anybody? Anybody? You guys both started to unmute yourselves and then remuted yourselves. Sure. Kate, what you need? Mm-hmm. There is to an extent. So, um, I happen to know a couple of novelists who are gamers. So Henry Vogel is a sci-fi writer, and he and I get together pretty regularly for a variety of game stuff. And then one of my oldest friends is an author named Jonathan Pembroke who does some different fantasy writing. And Jonathan and I bonded back in fifth grade in the early '80s over our shared love of role-playing games and other adventure games back then. Um, so both of them will attest to the fact that those kinds of world building things that you're talking about do have some heavy game design influences as a part of them. Um, One thing where both of them work together is they are iterative processes. This is not the bolt of inspiration out of the blue that you get this thunderclap and suddenly you've got the right answer the first time through. Um, you compare it to writing a song. I know folks that can sit down and they can turn out a pretty decent 3-minute radio friendly sort of tune in like the first pass through, and then they're just maybe tweaking some lyrics a little bit here and there, but they get the basic structure of the song the first time out the door right, as opposed to the folks that sit down and start outlining the novel. Okay, here's the journey that the main character is going to go on. Here are some journeys that some supporting characters are going to go on. So I know they're going to move from A to B to C to D in their personal progression. Now, how do I tell that story? Well, here are a couple of set pieces that I know I want to put in there. Well, how do I move them from set piece to set piece? And so you're developing that story as you go. You're writing that draft, you're putting your outline down, and then filling in all the different gaps in that outline. Similarly with a game design, what are the key things that I'm focused on? Okay, I need the players to be able to decide A, B, and C within the game. And in order to support those decisions, here's the information I have to provide them. And how do I get them that information? Okay, in the process of all of that, C is just getting really complex and it's distracting from A and B, which actually matter. So I'm going to go ahead and screen C out altogether, and we're just going to focus on A and B because otherwise it's getting too big. And what does that iterative process look like through which you make decisions about your game design and then test it, see what happens, and then maybe start screening things in and out. Mike Markowitz over at CNA refers to this as the cycle of proliferation of complexity and ruthless simplification. Right? Those two sort of follow each other circularly through the design process. Writing a book can be very similar. There's times where, all right, it's time to start cutting some things out. Okay, but I need to put this information back in to support a subsequent scene somewhere else. Oh, but now that scene's getting too complex, so let me cut some of that out. Now, can I go back and cut out some of the preceding material? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe I use that to point something in a different direction. Yeah, but iterative processes definitely. So Oregon Trail is folks that grew up in the 80s, 1980s era computer game. That should say era, not ers, of Old West exploration, right? It's very popular in schools, and everybody died of dysentery at some point throughout that Oregon Trail trip. But again, it was trying to provide the opportunity for some uh, understanding through historical context of make the same kinds of decisions that those people were faced with. Twilight Struggle, right? Board game in the Cold War between the U.S. and USSR. At the time I originally put this presentation together, the first time, it was the highest rated game on Board Game Geek. I think Gloomhaven may have bumped it out of the top slot by now, but I'm not 100% sure. But students are playing roles as U.S. versus Soviet leaders throughout the game, where they've got to make decisions, again, in historical context of, was this good, was this bad? Um, what are the right decisions of the options I'm faced with at the time? I can't just pick something completely out of the blue. These were the choices available. The analytical warfighting environment, this is one of the things we built for the NSA, and the idea was helping train some intel analysts for the NSA. And they were a lot of very small casual games. So one of them, Evil Associations, was one of the more popular ones. It The skill we were teaching was how to use an association matrix. So you've got this 6x6 grid of different people, and you've got to figure out how these 6 different people are connected to each other. And 1 and 2 may not be connected at all, but 1's connected to 3, 4, and 5, and 5's connected to 2. So these guys do have this interconnecting web of people. But how do I actually use that matrix, and how do I look at analyzing patterns of communication between these people to sort of understand how they're connected? One of these guys might be a taxi driver, another one's a tow truck driver. At some point, they're calling each other on the phone because taxis break down and tow trucks haul them to the shop. And so for a taxi driver to call a tow truck driver at 2 o'clock in the morning isn't that weird. But for the school teacher to call the tow truck driver at 2 o'clock in the morning might be a little more weird. And so if I see a call between a school teacher and a tow truck driver at 2 o'clock in the morning, that might be worth further investigation. And so those were some of the kinds of things that we were looking at helping push people into analyzing and understanding what it was they were looking at with those communication patterns. Um, Hammer Incorporated was a PR exercise for a class at the University of South Carolina. It was focused around PR reactions based on an industrial accident. And so we had people in the classroom playing different roles. Here's the media person. Here's a family member of someone who works at the factory. Here's the lawyer for the company that owns the factory. Here's the public spokesperson for the company at the factory and whatever. And so what happened was we gave everybody these different roles. We put the scenario up on screen. This whole thing was run off of a PowerPoint slideshow loop that just simply updated every 5 minutes or so and updated the situation. And so it started off with there was an industrial accident at this factory. Ambulance has been called. The whole place has been locked down. They're not letting people go home from work. We're not really sure what's going on. That's as much as we know. So media guys, what are you doing? Lawyers, what are you doing? PR guys, what are you doing? Family members, what are you doing? And then, so 5 minutes later, the slide changes. Well, now it comes out to find that somebody was crushed. The ambulance had to evacuate them. They've locked everybody down. They're saying it's to make sure that nobody else is hurt or that they've got everybody accounted for. But the family members are thinking, hey, it's because they don't want people talking or going to find lawyers and starting to get ready to sue, and they're going to start pressuring people to sign things before they. So the whole point was this scenario that folks had to talk their way through, but it was done on bare bones equipment, right? This was a PowerPoint slideshow, not unlike we're looking at right now, just on a timer. So every 5 minutes, the scenario updated with something else. There were probably 8 or 9 slides total, because the whole thing happened in one classroom sitting. So what are people doing as the story changes, and how are people working their way through that? Gemstone we talked about a bunch. This was the kickoff game, right? This was to jumpstart the curriculum for those ICTF students by forcing them to have to actually confront the material right out the gate. And that's what we did there with that kickoff game. This was the GEMSTONE model that we had to actually build under the hood in the computer system. And so the participants never saw this model until the last day of the exercise. And they said, here's what we were, here's how these things were all tweaking themselves and pushing and pulling underneath. The 3 things that were the measures against which the players were evaluated were those 3 boxes in the middle: support for the insurgency, the neutral population, support for the government. And obviously the government folks are trying to get support for them up as high as they can. Support for the insurgency is trying to get them up as high as they can. They're both tugging at the neutrals. All those blue boxes were all different things that the players had the opportunity to input into. So they could provide funds for certain things. They could make certain ROE changes. The government could have a narrative that's a story that they could tell. Same thing with the insurgents. And the insurgents had money that they could push into certain things. Aaron, you're right. This was loosely built off of that famous old Afghanistan model. But this was the underlying systems dynamic model that the ICTF faculty were using to teach for how to understand counterinsurgency at the strategic level. Understanding that the coefficients along all of those pathways were going to be different depending on any particular given insurgency at a time, but these were all different things that you needed to understand and be able to account for. Lost at Sea. So I used to use this at Wake Tech, and then a bunch of other faculty folks started doing it also. This was one of those introductions to the class kind of things. This is a Coast Guard exercise, a U.S. Coast Guard exercise. There's no direct tie into the material at all. This was simply let the students get to know each other. After we took roll the first day of class, kind of looked around the room and said, all right, is there anybody in the room sitting next to somebody you already know? Okay, you 2 people, trade seats, and let's get other folks around people they don't already know. All right, here, the 5 of y'all, here's your sheet. And so what it was is you're lost at sea. Your boat engine caught fire. It's starting to sink. You need to bail out into the life raft. Here are 20 things that you've got, or 15 things that you've got. That's your list of stuff over on the left. What do you take? What are the things you grab, and in what order of priority? And then as a group, we're going to discuss once you guys make your decisions and we figure out who's got what. And then we go through it all. And again, there's we are not trying to teach people how to survive a sinking ship in any class that is ever taught at Wake Tech. The whole point here was just to get folks engaged with their fellow students because there were some team projects that would be coming up later. And so let's give you a chance to get to know some people before you had to start working together. All right, some best practices, and Aaron, this may actually tackle some of the things that you're interested in terms of what do you do in the classroom. And so you mentioned having to teach people sort of understanding what war games were and how they work. One of the best practices is the instructor operates the game, players make the decisions. Don't try and give the players the rule book. Give them the options. Hey, U.S. leaders within Twilight Struggle. Here are the 3 cards that you have available to you. This one allows you to do this one allows you to do that, this one allows you to do this third thing. Don't teach them how to keep score. Like we're not focused on the scorekeeping piece. Focus them on the decisions. Once they make the decision, we're going to play card number 2, then you probably outside of class, whatever, actually put the card down on the map, adjudicate the move, do all the movement, adjudicate everything, come back and tell them, okay, as a result of card number 2, these 4 things changed on the map. This is what actually happened to you. Yep. So for the gemstone game itself, we provided a map at the start of each day that was a province level map of the different countries we were working in, and we had just unit icon symbols. Again, no actual values attached to them, just a NATO symbol on a map, and multiples of them as relevant for which battalions were placed where on the map. And we'd given everybody the cheat sheet ahead of time that said, here's what all the symbology is, and green, amber, red, black for the level of capability of the unit. Green being 90% or better, amber being 70 to 90, et cetera, et cetera. So military folks should already kind of know these things, but we knew that the ICTF audience, again, 80 students in there, at most a dozen Americans, and even the Americans in there, probably only half of them actually uniform folks. There were folks from like the Department of Energy or State Department or whatever, but there were people in there from the World Bank. There were people in there, again, it's the International Counterterrorism Fellows, so it's people from all over the world. A lot of them were military. There's some 1-star Nigerian general in there. There was a Ukrainian 2-star general, 1 or 2-star general in there. Senior service folks, so lieutenant colonels, colonels, and lower level generals from around the world in there. And we were getting pushback from the participants that the NATO symbology was confusing. I I didn't really know how to reply to that. Like, yeah, yeah, yeah. But it, and yeah, yeah. Well, it might have been. And so, Kate, I don't know how much you know about the NATO symbology as kind of a visual template that folks use within within a game context. That's just sort of standard stuff that you expect people to know, not just in the wargaming world, but in the military world. Like, that's how you put stuff on a map for where a particular unit is. And so if you're working with any NATO country anywhere, it's standardized. I mean, there is a NATO standard way to note all these things on the map. So the idea that we've got a bunch of people in class that didn't already know it, all right, fine, I can see folks from the Department of Energy or the Italian equivalent to the Department of Energy. Like, I get that those guys wouldn't understand that, but the fact that it wouldn't be desirable for them to have to learn it was the part that kind of boggled my mind a little bit there. That's the part that made me scratch my head and go, wait a minute. Why don't we want these people to know this stuff? So, I, Yeah, and that is absolutely correct. For me, the pushback from my seat wasn't, okay, fine, they don't all know this. It was, why can't we make this the standard and have them all adopt it? If we can agree that there isn't a universal one that everybody will automatically recognize, why not push this one as the standard? And that was one of the questions that I had there. Um, so, so Aaron, going back to those best practices, have the instructor operate the game. Let the players make the decisions, and then you actually crunch the numbers for them. Within history-based games, one of the big things in all of this is to compare the decisions the players made to the decisions that were made at the time by the people in those seats. And so, again, if you're playing Twilight Struggle, here are some options. Does Kennedy blockade Cuba or not blockade Cuba? Do you just invade Cuba? Do you nuke Cuba? Like, what are you going to do when the Cuban Missile Crisis comes up, and compare that to what actually happened historically? The challenge you run into there is, yeah, yeah, yep, yep, yep. There you go. The uh, part of the problem you run into with some of the history-based things is that some of the things for which there are the most games are, or the widest available, most easily available games, are the historical events people already know the most. And that's one of the challenges that you run into, is that if you're going to put people into decision-making context for the Vietnam War, like Fire in the Lake is a good way to do that. The problem is so many people already know so much about Vietnam. I get that, college kids today, maybe not as much as college kids when we were all in college, but yeah, but because it's all, it's now getting to the point where it's all ancient history. Vietnam is further away from today's school kids than World War II was when I was in school at that age, um, which is painful to say, but it's true. But yeah, but a great multifaceted complex situation to use for decision making from a variety of perspectives and a variety of participants is the Suez Crisis, right? The fact that you had Brits and French invading the Suez, and the U.S. played a pretty significant role in the Suez Crisis without ever putting a single boot on the ground. And so, can you find a good game that would work within the context of the Suez Crisis, or can you rapidly develop one, maybe even using one of the Matrix games that under Tom's model there, that you can rapidly develop one that this really happened, and there's a lot of competing, multifaceted decision making going on in the Suez Crisis that the students aren't going to know a thing about. And so you can put people in a variety of different positions where they've got to make consequential decisions within the game, and you have historical comparisons that they're not already going to know going into the game. And so that might be one to consider using in a historical environment. And again, the bulk of the examples I'm using are coming from history and social science. I don't have a good example of a bridge building engineering type of game that you could use for, competitive ironworking. I just don't have the background and knowledge to speak intelligently to particle physics as a game design process or something. So, um, some other best practices: opposed teams versus cooperative gameplay. So the idea of head to head within the classroom can be kind of cool because now you got some competitive juices flowing, but it can get out of hand. Or are we looking at cooperative gameplay where the participants are all playing on the same side, and so we as a group are trying to make a collective decision about the best way to approach something? Obviously, games like Forbidden Island or Pandemic play well to that. But the other thing you can do is, if Twilight Struggle as an example, split the classroom in half, and they're both playing the American side against the instructor who's playing the Russians, but they're both playing the American side, but they're doing it on two parallel tracks, so you can still be a little competitive, but not head-to-head competitive. Um, or are you teaching the same class with two different sections, and so you're going to play the two sections against each other? Maybe that's an available option. Um, how are you going to score this? Like, are you keeping consistent teams over the length of the entire term? Are these one-shot things in the classroom? How are you incorporating the scoring of the game into what's happening in the classroom? Do you want the score to matter in what happens in the classroom? Um, and that's something else to consider or take into account as a part of that. So some additional resources, PackSims, right? Rex Brynon's blog out there has sort of become the default touchstone around which the professional wargaming community coalesces. Board Game Geek's got a huge repository of information around gaming, and they've got an entire subsection in their forum on games in the classroom. Again, I'm bringing both these up not because you guys don't know who they are, but because a lot of the audiences that I really intend this presentation for are folks that don't know that Board Game Geek even exists. Alan Emmerich used to teach game design at the Art Institute of California. I'm not sure he's still teaching there anymore, but he does have a lot of great resources on game design on his site because that's what he was teaching, but he's got good ideas about how to do game design as an assignment. There's a giant bibliography that I've got posted over at the Armchair Dragoons. A lot of it was built out of some of my PhD research, but it's focused on games and learning and motivation and interactivity. And so there's a big research bibliography that's available over on the Dragoons, and I will post that link on the YouTube site as well, on the YouTube feed of this. And then, so some wrap up before we get into some Q&A here. Learning and training are not the same thing. Like, however you choose to characterize it, that's fine. I gave you the definitions that I was using for this presentation early on. But learning and training aren't the same thing. And because they aren't, we need to, whatever term you want to use to describe new skill acquisition versus existing skill rehearsal, like I don't care what term you slap on it, understand that you need to approach them differently when you're looking at game-based training or game-based learning. That you need different approaches for those two different conditions. Games and sims can be the same thing. They may not be the same thing. But you need to clearly identify the reason you are using the game. What is the why answer in all of this? Now, it doesn't have to tie to a specific task or function, and that's fine. But it does need a clearly articulated objective, and maybe the articulated objective is simply to wake people up. Maybe, and that's okay if that's what the objective is. Hey, we're going to reiterate this material by doing something a little off the wall just to maintain interest in the class, so it's not me droning in front of PowerPoints the whole time. That's cool. Like, you've clearly articulated what your objective is, but what is it ahead of time? Because that will tell you whether or not the game is the appropriate tool to use for what it is that you're after. But most don't be afraid to steal good ideas from other people. Like, there's plenty of good ones out there. Don't be afraid to steal them from folks. All right, so that wraps up all the formal stuff that I had. I do want to say there is a version of this presentation slightly tweaked that is available on the Armchair Dragoons site as just me talking over PowerPoint without the audience in the Q&A, but I did want to give an audience a chance to get engaged in the Q&A and discussion and conversation around this. So that's why I dusted it off to redo for here. So that's the official stuff I've got to talk over. Whatever else you guys have that y'all want to discuss, I'm more than happy to open the floor to all that. And as a part of that, I want to say hi to Adam. Howdy, Adam. I know you got here a little late, but glad you could make it. So, Aaron, what do you got? Hey, Yeah, absolutely. A correction. Sebastian's not full time at Georgetown. Sebastian's full time at Rand. He's an adjunct at Georgetown that teaches on the side. Yeah. No, no, he's a full time wargamer over at Rand who happens to teach wargame stuff over at Georgetown. Um, the so it you know depending on this goes back to what is it that you want your students to understand coming out of the game? Is it an appreciation of the composition and organization of the military? Is it the kinds of decisions that are made at different echelons in the security structure, whether you're talking company level, battalion level, brigade level, corps level, national level, like those? There are different kinds of decisions that get made at different levels. Um, Something that might be worth looking into is Jim Lunsford, who writes a lot of different games in support of the Command and General Staff College, but then turns around and commercializes them through different means. He had one, I want to say it was called Future Force. I don't remember for sure. I could find out from James Sterrett. But it was around here's a war that's sort of happening across the ocean somewhere. You're not worried about how to fight the war, you're worried about how to resource the war. And so, what are the kinds of forces you need to generate at home in order to set your guys downrange up for the best capability of success? Are you creating heavy units, light units, medium weight units? Are you investing in land power, air power, sea power? There's a variety of different things that need to happen because acquisition cycles have 2 and 3 and 5 year lead times. And so, based on here's what the intel thinks is going to happen over the next decade, where are you going to dump some of your investments and some of your decision making? So, yeah, there you go. You've got the link in the chat there. So, um, yeah. So, bear in mind again, the audience for which Jim Lunsford is aiming is Commander General Staff College folks who are um, these are mid-career U.S. military officers, mostly Army, occasional Air Force or Squid, kind of sneak in there. Occasional foreign military folks sneak in there, but 80% of that audience are U.S. military officers, and so that's where decisive action is designed for teaching those guys how to plan and execute a division level maneuver somewhere. And so it's complicated stuff. There's a heavy logistics model on there because you've got to be able to do that as a part of how to actually execute a division maneuver. So, but Future Force might be one to consider for what are important long range decisions that need to be made at the national security level. Um, yeah, 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 yeah. Something that may be worth Yeah, something that may be worth looking into at that higher level of how do you incorporate a variety of things that people can do, but also has very good scaffolding for helping the participants make decisions throughout the game, is look at some of the coin games from GMT. I don't know how much familiarity you may have with them. Um, Okay, so Colonial Twilight's not a great option only because it's designed as a two-player game instead of a four-player game instead of a multi-headed one. And so, yeah, But something like a distant plane or fire in the lake that has a little more contemporary relevance. You're not going to teach them a ton about um, current uh, current understanding of military as one of a variety of tools if you're trying to do Pendragon or Falling Sky or even Cuba Libre. But if you're looking at Andean Abyss, Fire in the Lake, or uh, Distant Plane especially, there's a lot that you can teach them around how military is one of several different things that you can work with because the cards abstract add in the abstraction of some non-military events. The military forces are very abstract in that they are either forces or bases. And so you're not worried about tanks versus grunts versus helicopters. No, there are forces and there are bases, and that's all you're worried about in those cases. So sort of permanent infrastructure or more mobile types of things that you can move around. The other thing that the coin games have is the coin games have the cards in there, the flowcharts in there for the bots. That if you only get 3 people available to play, you don't have the fourth person there. You use the bot. Well, what the bot works great for is somebody that's never played the game. You hand them the bot and you say, follow this flowchart for the first 2-3 turns, because while it may not ever make the best possible decision on the map, the bot is never going to lead you to a stupid decision on the map. And so that gives them the ability to sort of follow along and understand what I've got to do on any given turn. So, um, Kate's got a question. Labyrinth works also, again, 2-player versus 4-player. So, but the Labyrinth bots are also very good. Kate's got a question here. So, how much predictive ability does Wargaming offer? Well, you don't have to run away yet because there is oh, okay. Because there's a follow up to the coin stuff I want to get back to, but I want to make sure we get Kate's question in here. How much predictive ability does Wargaming offer? Someone wrote there's so much Wargaming to prepare for World War II, only kamikaze were surprised. So there's Wargaming for predictive courses of action is really over in the analytical world as opposed to the training world, and that's where you start to look at what is the purpose for the kinds of wargaming that you're looking to do. And so the sort of analytical wargaming that's looking towards predictive effects is very different than the kinds of iterative gaming that we're talking about here, which are more focused on training and learning sorts of things. It's not to say that there isn't some overlap, but it is a very different purpose than what I've described and outlined here in terms of things in the classroom. There there are abilities to pull some predictive effects out of there. And you mentioned the World War II piece. Like there were a lot other than the kamikazes that they had war gamed out at various times, and in some cases war gamed it out, got it right, and then ignored it, which wasn't always the best idea either. Um, but there are a lot of things that can be war gamed out ahead of time. One of the challenges you run into, and one of the things that the Navy saw with the kamikaze piece in all of this is there's a danger in projecting your own cultural priorities and biases and worldview on an opponent and playing that opponent as an alternate version of yourself. And that's sort of where we never saw the kamikazes coming necessarily. One of the challenges that a lot of red team folks have had dealing with Islamic extremism is the issue of sort of willingness to self-sacrifice, right? It is very hard to find folks in the West that see the concept of a suicide bomber as remotely noble, but it's a normal sort of thing in some Islamic cultures. And I don't want to be culturally insensitive about this. I know that I'm offering some wide sweeping generalizations, but the idea of that being an acceptable course of action to a particular cultural mindset is something that is an example of something that just straight up U.S. A normal U.S. G2 Intel sort of dude would never play as a part of the Red Force without having to be explicitly reminded of it. And so the kinds of analytical wargaming that you're talking about are absolutely useful. They happen all the time. Some of those dudes over at OSD Cape in the Pentagon do that kind of stuff. There are folks doing that in a variety of different places throughout the DoD, including some places we probably aren't allowed to talk about, and they're doing a good job of it. How well it gets listened to up the food chain, completely different answer. Matt Caffrey's book on wargaming does talk about one of the one of the war stories that came out of some wargaming with regards to the Middle East. When the Russians invaded Afghanistan in 1980, a lot of the U.S. military is like, well, we better start getting ready for a military response. And something they realized very early on is we can get some troops over to Afghanistan pretty quickly if we wanted to. We could put boots on the ground in the Middle East very quickly. Then what? Like, how do you feed them? How do you fuel them? What do they do about the ammo? Like, it's not just an issue of you've got to move a lot of this stuff around. It's very heavy. It's very volatile. It's a pain in the butt to move around. There's no way to do it quickly. And so maybe we need to start looking at some pre-supply, pre-stock sort of stuff. Maybe we start warehousing things in Diego Garcia. Maybe we start cutting some deals with people in the Gulf to pre-stock some things. Lo and behold, 10 years later, Desert Storm breaks out, and guess what? We've got warehouses full of ammo already pre-positioned on the other side of the ocean, and so it's very easy to have those logistics already in place because we learned the lesson in 1980 that, oh crap, we can't do what we're trying to do. And so that's one of the war stories that Matt tells in his book on wargaming. That's an example of an analytical outcome, probably along the lines of where you are. The question of do we just not do it enough? We probably don't. But if it's being done correctly, you're not going to find out about it. And that's no offense to you. I'm not going to find out about it. Like, nobody should be finding out about it because if they're doing it correctly, they're using a lot of source material that shouldn't be discussed in public, quite frankly. And so that's one of those things that we're probably not doing enough of it. And if we were, we shouldn't know about it. So I hope that kind of gets at an answer to your question there. Um, well, it's so first of all, a lot of people shy away from it just because of the term war and game. You know, that whole war is not a game. Like Jim Dunnigan's always, these aren't war games, these are historical conflict simulations. Except that they're not all historical. Some things are future looking. They're not all conflict. I mean, every war is a conflict, but not every conflict is a war. And so as soon as you start talking about conflict, now you're widening the gap a lot more. And then you start talking about simulations. Again, we've already seen simulations and games aren't necessarily the same things. And so the vocabulary matters in all of this. For for what I was discussing today, I was, if we go back to the very first slide, um, it's not wargaming in the classroom, right? It's any kind of games in the classroom. You can do Jeopardy quiz shows learning medical terminology, and that's fine. Like, that ain't wargaming, and that's totally fine. That's part of what we're trying to use for learning in the classroom. And so, wargaming more in a social science sort of context or a historical context, I think those are the appropriate places for those things to exist. But I think if you try to take some of that wargame paradigm for decision making in context and try and apply it in a math class, like, it's going to fall flat. That's not the appropriate kind of thing that you necessarily need in a math class or a physics class. And so I think the places where historical context becomes more irrelevant, or where courses of action are more constrained. Like, there's only so many ways you can build a bridge, you know, and I don't want people getting creative with a bridge that I got to drive over, right? I mean, there's a certain point at which I want you to do it by the book because the book is there for a reason. Um, I think those sorts of more deterministic outcomes don't lend themselves as well to the more complex types of games where we're talking more process within the context of a simulation. I don't think those work as well. Um, I think again, it goes back to what's your purpose there. If the purpose is I'm trying to learn vocabulary, no, because there's a finite set of outcomes that you're after. But if you're sort of, how do I have a conversation in a foreign language, then yeah, at that point you've got more room, more degrees of freedom, if you will, that you can be that you can explore through those that game based learning. I guess is the better way to say it. So, Aaron, I know you got to drop off in all of this. I hope you're here for half a second longer. Going back to some of the coin stuff, Adam's actually seen a couple of these things that we've done at Origins at the War College, or at our war game program at Origins. Um, One of the things you can do with the coin games is you can make them multiplayer within a single faction, where you've got folks making political decisions amongst the other political players that you've got out there. They decide whether or not to use the card on any given term, or what kind of ops they want to go execute, or what kind of resources they're going to allocate. And then the military guys are the ones actually standing around the map moving things around. So you've got your political dudes that are never anywhere near the map talking to each other. The military guys never talk to each other, but they've got to actually go execute the political guidance that they're given. And again, yeah. Ping me on the side after all of this. I'm happy to expand on that. We've done that several years in a row at Origins using a distant plane, and it's a ton of fun every time we do it. The players really get a sense for political decision making separate from the military decision making, and with their military hat on, they learn very quickly that some of that political guidance is really vague and or bat crap crazy. Like, how do I do what you're telling me to try to do? I don't have the resources to pull this off. I'm just going to have to muddle along. And then they get a real good sense for some of the pickles that we put the military folks in along the way. So, no, no. There's only two Brant Guillory's in the country. The other guy's an Air Force veteran who lives up in the Midwest and does air freight. So, you bet. You bet. Um, yeah, I'm done with the formal part of this presentation here. So, Adam, I know you were here a little late. If you got any questions, feel free to throw them at me. Kate, if you've got anything else, let's shoot. And if we need to wrap up, we wrap up. No, no problem. Glad to do it. Adam, you got anything? You're talking to a muted mic, or just type in the chat. Either one. All right. So, if nobody's got anything else, I'm gonna wrap this thing up. We'll